This watch is overpriced. That watch is overpriced. We hear, read, and say that all the time, and it feels like we say it about all watches. And it's true. Watches keep getting more and more expensive, and the saying in the industry is always keep raising prices. But for me, I do argue that although expensive, not all watches are as overpriced as others. So here are 10 watches that are massively overpriced for what you get, and also a suggestion or two on where you can get something comparable for less, and maybe better for same. Bremont Supermarine. The first thing you need to do is park your possible dislike for Bremont's recent rebranding efforts. Ignore that. Ignore the Terra Nova. Just take a look at the Supermarine. Doesn't look half bad. I mean, in a lineup of Tudor or Seamaster 300Ms or any other plain black divers, this one competes. It's 100% as middle of the road as a ton of other watches. The price though? $3,950 US. It doesn't sound like much from a mid-tier brand, but the specs are revealing. 50 hours of power reserve. Longines will do closer to 80 at 25% cheaper. Tudor does the same, plus guarantees Metas precision for $400 more, and you get a superior bracelet. Is it a Selita movement? No, but it's an ETA base variant that does a decent job, just not at this price point. I put no value in 904L steel, and the rest of the features in no way stand out from a Tudor or Longines. It might not be the most egregious price in the world, but when Bremont say they are going for the value space, then this price is just wrong. At $3K, I would have been happy, but no more. The price in 2023 for the most egregious price increase clearly went to JLC. Some watches have gone up by 40%. In fairness, this was in part down to the fact that JLC apparently forgot to raise prices on a rolling basis like everybody else does, and instead did what came across as one big price increase. But the fact remains, today a JLC Reverso Monophrase Tribute will set you back $11,500. Is it a good movement? Sure, JLC are pretty good at making movements, but this one doesn't have a display case back, so any premium for perlage and anglage is unwarranted because you're never going to see it. Spec-wise, it's fine for this kind of dress watch. JLC does good work when it comes to case finishing and dials. The Reverso is a gorgeous watch, but this is pretty much their entry-level model. The most basic of basic watches. You don't get a skeleton dial. You don't get a lacquered dial either. There's just a stainless steel case back. The case mechanism is fun, but it loses its appeal when there's nothing on the back to keep you interested. And you can get a Cartier Tank or a Santos or a Nomos or a Grand Seiko SLG W003 for $10K. I'm a lot more okay with $18K for a dual-face calendar or potentially even $27K for a steel dual-face chrono with a skeleton chronograph. But $11,500 for a rectangular dress watch is just too much. TAG Heuer are having a bit of a resurgence. They've recently released some really cool watches. My personal favorites are the glassbox models like the Skipper and the Carrera. But a while back, they also released the Otavia GMT, which I believe is a very good looking GMT. This is a ETA-based GMT movement with a good but not stellar case and dial finishing. The Tudor Black Bay GMT is, in my opinion, finished to a high degree. I felt that the dial was more detailed, the plots were sharper, and it was just overall more precise. The bracelet was infinitely better. Basically nothing on the tag justifies that premium over the comparable Tudor. It's a good watch, but for what you get, it's easily $1,000 too expensive. Blancpain 50 Fathom Swatch version. I suppose it's easy to bash Swatch for the pricing of their collab watches, but in fairness, I never really felt the Moon Swatch was completely off. Sure, it was a little bit more expensive than the rest of the typical Swatch lineup, but for the iconic Moon watch, I felt it was at least in the ballpark considering how popular it ended up being. The 50 Fathoms, though, is bananas, and it is for a couple of reasons. First of all, the 50 Fathoms, although it's a Blancpain collab that is a lot more expensive than the Omega in general, Blancpain is not a household name, and the 50 Fathoms isn't either. The Moon watch has some level of general recognizability, where the 50 Fathoms for a lot of people requires an explanation. Secondly, the System 51 movement just is not worth it. The idea of making the 50 Fathoms mechanical and respecting the beaver mindset of quartz will never be in a Blancpain is cool, but it's just too much for that movement in that specific watch. Thirdly, the strap is terrible, and the watch, despite everything, just doesn't feel like it justifies that kind of premium. This was a watch that should have been metal. Obviously, that was an impossibility, but plastic is plastic, and that's too much. G-Shock would have been a better option. Hublot Classic Fusion. You can't have a overpriced list without mentioning Hublot. Hublot are hated for all sorts of reasons that I've spoken about at length. In general, I actually don't mind them that much. I think they've got some cool sapphire models that are over the top and in your face, but that's a good thing. They serve their purpose. They have an audience, and despite not being stellar in the world of watchmaking skills, it's just an aspirational product that some people are willing to pay for. But the Classic Fusion is an integrated sports watch on a rubber strap with a flat dial and a Selita movement inside. essentially the same variant of Solita that you find in a Christopher Ward 12 titanium, which costs $6,000 less. Maybe Hublot could make a better bracelet, but it's on a rubber strap, and CW is available on either. The case is not massively better done on the Hublot. If there ever was a ripoff, then this is it. Like I said, get a CW or pay more for an IWC Ingenieur. The IWC is also overpriced to a degree, but nowhere near to the extent of the Hublot. It's also more of an icon. Oris don't usually get bashed a lot for their prices. They've been a reasonable value brand for a long time with fan favorites like the Aquis, the Diver 65, and the Pro Pilot. But some years back, Oris went on a journey to ditch sourced movements in favor of in-house calibers. Any company that does that inevitably raises prices, which is understandable. Making an in-house movement is an investment, and the investment has to be recouped, and you do that by raising prices. Also, in-house, in theory at least, allows you to position yourself at a higher quality point. Saying you made something yourself allows you to charge more. The movement on the inside, the Caliber 400, is a pretty good movement by now. It's solid, it's got excellent specifications, and it's also reasonably attractive to look at. But it's somewhere between $3,500 and $4,000 depending on where you live. For a titanium sports watch, you're paying a lot more than you really should. It's cheaper than a Pelagos, it's titanium, unlike a Nomos Club Sport, but it's still more than what the Oris brand can carry. The Diver 65s, to some extent, have been hit by the same problem. When it came out initially, it was a bit of a smash hit for Oris and was a true value buy. But now where Tudors come with T-Fit clasps, Metas, and Jubilee bracelets, the Diver 65 has failed to keep up. In all cases, I'd go down in price to a Nomos or stay more or less at the same price point and get a Tudor instead. Sure, their titanium models are a step up in price, but overall, I do feel you're not getting quite enough bang for your buck. IWC Big Pilot 43. Just under $10K for a steel watch on a leather strap. You get a display case back that exposes a pretty solid movement on the inside. IWC does a good job of spiffing up their movements, but the problem here is that you're paying Submariner prices for a Big Pilot. Maybe you think the Big Pilot is the more interesting watch. I do, but it's on a leather strap. That's cheaper to do irrespective of the quality of the leather. It's got a completely flat dial, which is in keeping with the principles of a Flieger watch, but it makes for a non-premium, cheaper to put together dial. The case is super well made and it's not unimatic levels of sandblasting. Work has definitely gone into this design, but this is positioned as a premium product, and it isn't really. Other IWCs and their prices can sometimes be defended. The Ingenieur is a Genta. It's more complex in terms of design. The dial is far more intricate. Maybe it's still too expensive to some degree, but you can at least make the argument. The same goes for a Ceratanium Pilot Chrono, but this is just a Big Pilot. No amount of icon status can justify that premium. 8K, and I'd say okay. The thing about Cartier is you can't always knock them for movements. Cartier does in-house. Cartier also does high-end elaborate movements, but they also use Solita, they also use sourced Piaget movements, and sometimes they throw in a quartz movement. A good quartz movement, but still a quartz. I still remember the time I heard Archie Luxury scream about the plastic case holding a movement in place in a Cartier. We all know what he shouted. Point is, Cartier is about aesthetic. The standards we apply to Omega and Tudor and others for movements don't apply. I like the Santos Dumont, I like it a lot, but over 5K is a lot for this watch. Of course, it's half price of a JLC mono-faced Reverso, but there are Raymond Wiles and Nomoses and Frere Constant mood faces that cost less, where you get comparable finishing and specs. You're totally paying for the Cartier logo and the Cartier aesthetic. Again, it's not a bad watch at all, but the pricing is off. How much does the Speedmaster in steel cost? About $8,000. How about a Rolex Daytona? $15,000. Double the price. So, is a Daytona 7K better than an Omega? I would say no. It's more desirable, it has a much higher resale value, but the watch is not 7K better in any objective model-to-model comparison. Now here's a question for you. Now that you know that the Daytona in steel is 7K more expensive, almost double compared to the Speedmaster, which is more expensive? The Setna Gold Speedmaster or the Gold Daytona? Depending on the model, you could potentially be paying more for the Speedmaster. Granted, once you get to gold watches selling for more than $40,000, whether one watch is 42 and the other is 44 is likely not going to make a huge difference. Also, at this price point, we're in a space where brands like to believe that they can create Veblen goods out of thin air. So they just do that, what Melvin Udall did, and they took away all reason and accountability from their pricing. But really, in the two-tone space, the picture is potentially worse. The Speedmaster in some models and in some markets is more expensive than a two-tone Daytona. Hopefully this is just premium pricing and not some signal of a future where Omega believes they can price the steel model of a Speedmaster at 15K, but I think it's off by a huge margin. Omega Seamaster 300M, no time to die. I own this watch. I love this watch. In a recent video, I said that if I had only one watch for the rest of my life, this would likely be the watch I would keep. But I didn't pay retail for this watch. There's almost a 50% premium for this Bond franchise titanium watch. That's insanity. Maybe some people bought it at retail. Maybe some collectors just closed their eyes, dropped down the MasterCard and said, I want it anyway. But considering that I generally see the Seamaster 300M as still one of the best value luxury drivers out there, this price has always been mind-blowingly off. Get a regular 300M or a Pelagos, but not this at retail. I asked myself, do I want to include the Lange 1 or almost all Lange and Söhne watches on the list? The fact is, most watches from most brands drop in value once you've driven them over the curb. I also didn't want this video to be about which watches drop the most in price on the secondary market. Some watches out there tank big time, some much more than the ones I've had on this list. And this list hasn't been about secondary pricing. It's been about initial pricing relative to competitors. But Lange, so many of their models get sold and almost instantly hit half price on the secondary market. Part of that is because precious metal watches just generally tank more than steel models from high-end brands, and also because steel models are typically more rare. But the Lange 1, for all the praise it gets, considering it's a flagship model, it's just bananas high. For a lot of people, Lange have been knocking on the door to the Holy Trinity because of their stellar complications and movement finishings. But in a lot of cases, the hype doesn't translate. The Odysseus is going to hold its value. Some of the ultra-limited models are going to do well as well, but watches like the Lange 1, the Saxonia, and a lot of others are good, but not that good for the price. Go have a look at a Vacheron Overseas instead of an Odysseus. Consider a Grönefeld over a Lange 1. At these price points, value as a concept takes on a different meaning. But overall, I don't think Lange necessarily are always worth their price. Not always, at least. Finally, we have Panerai. Now, Panerai aren't popular anymore. They've had their moment and people kind of moved on. The Stallone watches are just not in anymore, which is a shame because I still appreciate luminors and radiomirs and submersibles. They are icons. They are distinctive, and today a lot of them are available in 42, 40 and 38 millimeters. Size doesn't have to be a problem anymore. Also, $5,500 to $6,000 for a base Panerai is expensive for sure, considering the movement, the finishing, and the lack of a steel bracelet. But I've seen worse transgressions. But Panerai are weird with their pricing. Why? Because they quickly jump from 6K for a base luminor to 8K. And what do you get for the money? You get a sandwich style. You get a polished case instead of a satin or brushed case, and you get a movement that has a date window for $3,000 more. Consider this example. The new Omega Aquaterra costs about $6,600. It's got a flat black dial. Now imagine Omega says to you, if you want the teak deck dial, it costs you $8,000. You're not going to think $2,500 for a teak dial and a date window is reasonable, especially not since you're getting a Metas movement in both models. On the Luminor, you get a small seconds hands. But seriously? Sandwich dial, polish and small seconds and date window, and another not really stellar movement for $2,500, almost $3,000 more? It's too much. I love their watches, but it comes across as completely off. These are some of the watches that I feel are most massively overpriced. They're not the only ones. You'll likely notice that I didn't mention a lot of watches below 3K. If you've watched my videos before, you know why. In that space, there's massive competition. Keeps everybody price-wise in check. And also, there are more active compromises in quality that are usually reflected in the pricing. There are examples, but it's typically not as bad as when you go above $5,000 or $6,000. That's where branding and positioning start to affect the pricing, and that's what you see in the examples I brought. Pay attention when you go above $5,000 or $6,000. I mean, always pay attention, but do extra due diligence above that price point. Tell me, what are your most egregious examples of high prices? And also, which watches do you think at a given price point are fairest priced? Let me know in the comments. Like, subscribe. Cheers.